Well, good evening, everyone, once again, and welcome to this All Hallows Eve edition of the Look into the Holy Book Devotional. I am your host, Charles Logan, uh, wishing you well and thanking you for joining us this evening. Well, this evening we're going to talk about God's covenant with Abraham and the Jewish people's long road to freedom. Ever since God had made his covenant with Abraham, obedience and the promised land have been inseparably combined. Now, the possession of the land has been dependent on the people's commitment to worship God and to keep his commandments. For 3,000 years, they have struggled to claim their heritage, and they will continue to do so. However, God is faithful and he will keep his promise, and his people will have their land. I have a passion for history, and I think all of you know that. I have a passion for archaeology, and especially as it enhances and it confirms the truth of the Bible. Now, I also believe that we as Christians have an obligation to support and defend our Jewish brothers, not only because Scripture says that we should, and that's in Genesis 12:3, but also because we are their family, sons of Abraham, by virtue of our spiritual adoption, as Paul explains very clearly in Galatians 3:29. So it stands to reason that the history of the Old Testament is also our history. Its stories, its accounts. Um, Many of these legends that we call legends and myths are not necessarily myths or legends because many of them are based in fact, actually. So as I research these devotionals, I use several sources, and the Bible first and foremost, of course, but other sources, books like Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, and magazines like the Biblical Archaeological Review. Now, it was just the other day while I was reading the winter issue of the BAR that I came upon something that caused me to look into the subject that we are going to explore this evening. Now, here's a quote from an article by Jonathan Alder titled The Genesis of Judaism. And it reads, and I quote, "From its earliest origins, Judaism emerged and developed in manifold directions. Rabbinic Judaism was one pathway that Judaism continued to thrive and expand. But other parallel and no less influential byways emerged. In fact, both Christianity and Islam are well rooted in the Judaism whose origins we have explored here. Now, viewed in this way, the emergence of Judaism was the catalyst for setting the course of much of the world history over the past 2,000 years. The article talks a lot about when Judaism began to embrace the laws of the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament that we call ascribed to Moses. Now, the Torah regulates every aspect of the lives of the Jewish people. In fact, Judaism is synonymous with keeping the law of Moses. There are commandments that apply to daily prayers, rituals, and festivals, ritual purity, conjugal law, agriculture, family, civil and criminal law, marriage, and just about anything you can think of pertaining to daily life. It wasn't just dietary laws and circumcision that separated the Jews from the Gentiles. You might define it as a separatist, almost elitism, or whatever you want to call it. It was but the adherence to the law, and was and is Judaism pure and simple. So, with the exception of the beginning of the 2nd century BC, I don't know of a time recorded in the Bible when God's chosen defined themselves as a people who came anywhere near keeping the law of Moses. Now, of course, that's God's commandments. Of course, there were the covenants that were made between Noah and Abraham. In the first covenant, God promised to maintain an inherent relationship between creator and creation by promising to never destroy the world by flood again. Now, the covenant with Abraham was a promise to create from him a great nation that would worship him as their God, and that he would offer protection and land to Abraham and his descendants in exchange for worshiping him exclusively and performing the ritual of circumcision as an outward sign of the agreement to abide by this covenant. Of course, there was also the matter of obeying God too. Now, at this time in the history of God's chosen people, they were little more than a group of mostly wandering tribes going from place to place with their livestock migrating eventually to the lands of Canaan and Egypt. Now, there were covenants, but there were really no laws to speak of, and little more than the ritual circumcision to separate them from the multitude of other people groups and tribal cultures inhabiting the land in the second millennium BC. Now, it was not until the time at Mount Sinai, actually, during their wanderings in the wilderness, that they became one with a common heritage and belief system that defined them as a people. Now, the foundation of that belief system was the law that Moses received from God, the law that would become known as the Torah, the law of Moses, the law that would finally and forever define them as Jewish. In other words, a mandate from God to be obedient. Well, the title of our devotional, of course, is The Covenant with Abraham and the Long Road to Freedom. Excuse me. I'm not sure that any of us ever really thought about a possible connection between a covenant people commanded to keep the Mosaic law and their possession of the land that was promised through the covenant with Abraham. Now, this is certainly not a scholarly debate. It's just a proposal on my part. And I respect anyone who doesn't agree with me, of course. Now, through the Old Testament accounts, there is little real evidence that God's chosen people even made a serious attempt to obey God by keeping his commandments, the law, the Torah. In the same respect, there is much historical and archaeological evidence that the land that was promised as their heritage to the Jews was actually never under their exclusive control for more than 200 years or so, with the possible exception of a short independence under the Maccabees during their revolt against the Seleucids. Now, that is until the 1947 General Assembly Resolution 181 that granted the Jewish people their homeland. Now, it's almost as if God said, keep my commandments and you will keep your land, or disobey me and lose it. Now, people understood one thing, and please understand this. My intention is certainly not to be critical of the Jewish people. And I mean, my goodness, we have been guilty of being unfaithful as a people ourselves many times. Was it in the nature of God's chosen people to disobey? Is it that they just couldn't help themselves from being influenced by all those pagan idol worshippers that surrounded them? So when did the general tendency to ignore the law become an accepted lifestyle? Well, besides the fact that accounts of the patriarchs include indications that these early Israelites acknowledged, respected, and even included pagan idols in their worship. At Mount Sinai, even Moses, when he came down with the Ten Commandments, the people had already constructed a golden calf and set it up for worship. Now, God was faithful in his promise to guide them and and protect them, even in the face of their disobedience. Uh, they entered the land, and on their first encounter, they refused to go in. So 40 years, they complained, disobeyed, and revolted, not giving the covenant much thought. Now, even as the conquest under Joshua took place, they did not keep God's commandments to take the land and destroy the people that were living there. The coastal regions and the outer lowlands were still in control of the Canaanites, those wicked pagans that sacrificed their children to Molech. So let's fast forward past the time of the judges, when there was an uneasy peace, punctuated at times by sporadic battles, and that was really never more than a fragile coexistence until the united monarchy under the first King David. Now, during this time, around 1000 BC, David and the Israelite army extended the boundaries to their greatest extent. God made a covenant with David. Thank goodness this covenant was unconditional. God promised to bring the Messiah out of his line, that Solomon would succeed him and build the temple. The covenant reaffirmed that the land that was promised to them would be a place for my people, that they shall not be disturbed by the wicked. That's from 1 Samuel 7:10. Yet under his reign, there was still no indication that the Torah was read frequently to the people, nor was keeping the law a priority. However, things really fell apart under the reign of Solomon. God's promise that Solomon would build the temple was fulfilled, but before Solomon died, the temple was already defiled with pagan idols and worship. Now in 1 Kings 11:6-10, we read, God was not well pleased with Solomon. Influenced by his many wives and concubines, Solomon became enmeshed in pagan worship. He allowed his wives to turn him to worship false gods. Now it was not only Solomon who had a hard time keeping the commandments in Exodus 23, thou shalt have no other gods before me. It was God's chosen people also. Now granted, the children of Israel were surrounded everywhere they went with those who worshipped a plethora of gods. Sarah, the matriarch of Judaism, secreted away the idols of her father. The golden calf incident and discoveries of pottery in northeastern Sinai that mention Yahweh and his consort, Asherah. It was not uncommon for the average Jew to have a shrine in their homes dedicated to a pagan god. We were told of several Reformation movements that were undertaken to return the people to the sole worship of Yahweh. But the northern kingdom was notorious for having a series of kings that worshipped pagan gods. But the most notorious thing that desecrated the temple can be found in 1 Kings 23, verse 4, during the reign of Josiah, as a matter of fact. And here's what it says. The king ordered Hilkiah, the high priest, the priest in rank, and the doorkeeper to remove from the temple of the Lord all the articles made for Baal and Asherah, and all the starry hosts. He burned them outside in the fields of the Kidron Valley, and took the ashes to Bethel. He continues in verse 7. He also tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple of the Lord, the quarter where women did weaving for Asherah. Now, it was during the reign of Hosea, the last king of Israel, that the kingdom fell to the Assyrians in 721 BC. Now, from that time on, what had been the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Judah were under the control of the Assyrian Empire, even though Hezekiah had been miraculously saved by the divine hand of God. Judah became a vassal state, paying a very heavy tribute to Assyria. So when you look back at the troubles that the children of Israel had in keeping the commandments, the time seems to coincide with their loss of control of their lands. So here it is. David unifies the tribes into the United Kingdom with its capital in Jerusalem. He expands the territory to include the largest area that the kingdom would see. The notoriously corrupt and sinful northern kingdom fell, and the lands that David conquered became an Assyrian province. The United Kingdom lasted from 1047 BC to 940 BC. The divided kingdom lasted from 721 BC for a total of 212 years. Not as long as the United States has been a country. However, even during this time, there is archaeological evidence that indicates their Canaanite neighbors were victorious over the kings of the divided kingdom. Now, I'm certainly not the final resource for this conclusion, but it seems consequential that God's chosen people never fully, faithfully followed the commandments in the Torah, with the exception of the several Reformation movements that were actually short-lived. Although there is no such thing as a coincidence, it seems that the loss of their heritage, their land, coincided with the failure to identify as Jews by keeping God's commandments. Now, an interesting point that was brought up by the author of the article that I previously quoted is that the evidence points to the 2nd century BC, before the adherents to the laws of the Torah were generally accepted and enforced as authoritative. Now, some scholars believe that the acceptance of the Torah as an identifying element in the Jewish faith did not occur until the Persian period around the 3rd century BC. So, ironically, it was the Persian king Artaxerxes that sent Ezra from Babylon to Jerusalem with a royal injunction to enforce the Mosaic Torah upon the people of Yehud. Now, that is the Persian name for the province of Judea. Now, ritual items that identified adherence to the Torah show up in quantity during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Items like the mikveh and the ritual purification bath, the incorruptible stoneware, the mezuzah at the doors, and the frequent reading of the Torah in the temple. Who knows if these reforms would have made any difference in the Jews' long journey to freedom, but we do know that laws, covenants, and commandments were broken over and over again. So there's no doubt whatsoever that the journey of the Jewish people, the long history of their evolution of faith, their trials and victories, and had a profound impact on the history of mankind and our own Christian faith over the last 2,000 years. Now, God knew that the Mosaic laws could not be kept faithfully. It was an impossibility, but God had a remedy that had been planned from the very beginning. A Messiah that would fulfill the law by becoming the perfect sacrifice. He would usher in the age of grace through faith in Christ. Now, I know that I've presented some information that some may find to be uncomfortable. Well, it certainly wasn't my intention to put our Jewish brothers in a bad light by any means. Considering all of the events that have occurred since October the 7th, We must provide unwavering support to the defense of their lands and of their people. They're in a struggle, not only for their right to exist, but for all people to live and worship by the promises of the one true God, without fear of reprisal or persecution. There will always be an element that will want to destroy the truth of the prophecy that God will protect his chosen, and by virtue of our own adoption into the family of Abraham, and because of the salvation brought to us by Christ's sacrifice, we are subject to that same promise also. So what do we take away from our time together this evening? Well, first of all, we're in a struggle for the right to believe that God is in control of everything and that he must have a place in our society to guide and influence decisions that will have an effect on our future, of our people, and of our country. Secondly, I believe that we are very close to becoming a country like France. Over a period of just a few generations, France has become a bastion of secularism, where many churches have become museums rather than places of worship. We must exercise our God-given right to choose to have a country that honors God. So let us embrace the promise in 2 Chronicles 2:14, where it says, "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, pray and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land." Well, that concludes our time together this evening. And once again, I consider it a privilege to be able to share this time with you. So I, once again, am Charles Logan, your host, wishing you a wonderful rest of the weekend and week to come. And Lord willing, we will be able to get together again next Thursday for another 20 minutes or so. So thank you once again, and I wish each and every one a pleasant rest of their days, and may God bless each and every one of you. Thank you once again, and good night.